This last week, Blizzard finally pushed some of the missing tier sets to the public test realm, so today we are testing the Vengeance Demon Hunter tier set, and I need all of you to know now that we're going to be doing some weird shit, so bear with me. This by far is the most engaging tier set bonus that we are seeing among all of the tank sets so far, so in this video we are going to break down how the tier set works, work through some of the potential talent builds, and see if we can make them work in a dungeon scenario. Let's not waste any time though and dive right in. The 2-set bonus has two parts. First, soul fragments heal for 10% more, and generating a soul fragment increases your fire damage by 2% for 6 seconds. Multiple applications may overlap. As we start hitting training dummies, we quickly notice that this will most likely be a passive trait and something that the DH won't really need to think about. On average, the DH will always be able to main 2 to 3 stacks of this buff during combat, which will be increasing all their fire damage that they deal. This will directly affect most of your non-filler spells like Spirit Bomb, Immolation, Aura of Feldev, and Sigil of Flame, Fiery Brand, etc. There wasn't really much to test to this, so let's jump into the 4-set and start to unpack how this set works. The 4-set causes Shear and Fracture to deal fire damage, and after consuming 20 soul fragments, your next cast of Shear or Fracture will apply Fiery Brand for 6 seconds to its target. The first part of this set really just plays into the 2-set bonus, turning your filler from physical to fire damage. The juice of this set really comes from the relationship between soul fragment consumption and Fiery Brand applications. I had a ton of thoughts about this, but first I need to figure out how exactly this set works. After consuming 20 soul fragments, you'll gain a buff called Recrimination, which will then apply Fiery Brand to the next target you decide to shear or fracture. For those who don't know, Fiery Brand is a single target damage over time effect that primarily functions as a form of damage reduction, reducing the damage dealt to the Demon Hunter by that target that is affected by 40%. Looking at details, it seems that it's relatively consistent, being procced every 30 seconds or so. Obviously, this depends on a lot of things, which really got my gears turning. What talents can we actually take that will impact our soul fragment generation? The first thing that came to mind was really in the class tree, and it's a talent called Soul Sigils. This talent generates one lesser soul fragment if the DH hits an enemy with a sigil. This doesn't really scale well into AoE, but in single target this can be a small increase in generation. Another talent that can provide more souls is actually Chaos Fragments, which gives Chaos Nova a 30% chance per target hit to generate a lesser soul fragment as well. This is going to be way more useful in mythic dungeons, but in larger pools you can definitely high roll on an insane amount of frag generation. Now, with picking up these talents, you'll definitely have to make a trade, which would have to be one of the capstones. I personally would drop the Hunt, but we can talk about that more later. While playing with Soul Sigils, I was reminded of Fodder to the Flame talent with all of these demon spawns, which sparked more ideas in the spec tree. I wanted to try trading Fodder for Soul Carver, which is a 1-minute cooldown that generates up to 5 soul fragments, which will help us fast track the tier set. You could in theory get a similar effect from Elysian Decree, but we're going to stick to Soul Carver for now. With this, we're able to get our first Fiery Brand proc only 8 seconds into combat, which is a good sign. Something that didn't really occur to me at first was how this is going to interact with our regular Fiery Brand. I had concerns that it might overlap instead of being additive. Luckily, similar to using Fell Devastation after Metamorphosis, if this tier set procs and is used on a target that's already afflicted by Fiery Brand, it's just going to add to the remaining duration. Anyways, with over an 8.5 minute test, we had 19 procs of this tier set, giving us Fiery Brand roughly every 26 seconds on average in single target. I also casted Fiery Brand 6 times, and while not perfect, we had 34% uptime on Fiery Brand, which is actually kind of insane. So this is really where the degenerate stuff comes in. I haven't really explored most of the right side of the spec tree, but there are some interesting choices here that can really bolster this tier set. I understand that the pathing is going to be suboptimal, but I'll get to that in a bit. With Mythic Plus in mind, I wanted to test the good old bulk extraction. In essence, this is a 1.5 minute cooldown that extracts up to 5 soul fragments from enemies and instantly consumes them. This is going to be purely based on how many targets you're near, so in single target it'll extract only 1 fragment. I wanted to know if this would actually work with the tier set or not. While it won't work with the 2 set, meaning that it won't increase your fire damage at all, the souls that it consumes will play into the 4 set, meaning that you can actually further fast track Fiery Brand. Now, I want to be clear. The pathing to get to bulk extraction sucks. I don't think that this will actually be worth pursuing because it requires you to spend a point into Meteoric Strikes, which isn't really needed in almost any situation, and then another point into Fell Flame Fortification, which grants a small magic damage reduction while Immolation Aura is active, but this is just kind of too niche. Though, what if we push this build further? I wanted to know if this tier set would actually interact with the talent Burning Alive. That talent causes Immolation Aura to actually spread Fiery Brand to nearby enemies every other second. I started slapping some AoE dummies in Stormwind and pretty quickly figured out that it works. Not only that, but Fiery Brand actually did a good bit of our damage, which I thought was interesting. Between the direct damage and the damage over time effect of Fiery Brand, it was actually getting close to 18% of our damage. So what if we ran Charred Flesh as well? This will now extend Fiery Brand by half a second whenever the target is hit by Immolation Aura. I actually also wanted to test Revel in Pain, but in order to do that, we'd actually need to take some damage, so that's what we did. We made our way over to Freehold. If you didn't watch my other tier set testing videos, I've been trying to utilize this testing strategy for two reasons. First, I actually want to hit more than 5 targets. Secondly, this gives us more of a dynamic testing environment when soloing because we need to be aware of damage profiles, positioning, casts, and what have you. This is also generally just more enjoyable trying to solo content, even though there aren't any affixes. I started with a plus 10 attempt, and it didn't take too long to get it down, but I was missing my weak aura package, and my bars just felt messy, so I wanted to fix that up. Before we did that though, my damage breakdown from that pull looked something like this. We had Spirit Bomb dealing an insane amount of damage, followed by Immolation Aura, Sigil of Flame, and then Fiery Brand. I felt like this was okay, but I think we can really push up the Fiery Brand damage and the uptime. Because of the tier set increasing our fire damage, along with the talent Fiery Demise, we had one goal in mind. Focus as much on keeping up Fiery Brand as possible. In single target, we were able to get roughly 35% uptime, but in AoE, Fiery Brand is now going to be extended and spread to nearby mobs. I was hoping that Revel in Pain was going to do more healing than it did, but sadly it fell short. I'm going to have to look into this more in a few seconds. Basically, any damage that Fiery Brand does will give you an absorption shield for that amount once it expires. In order to get a little more uptime though, I decided to change talents once more to get a second charge of Fiery Brand and reduce its cooldown by 15 seconds. I've never used this talent before, so I'm curious on how it will do. I quickly imported my weak aura and we got to work. The first thing that I noticed about this build is that I was sustaining almost 130k DPS in some situations, which I thought was pretty impressive compared to some of the other tanks that I've tested this far. At the end of this poll, we saw an outstanding 93% uptime on Fiery Brand, though keep in mind that this is not on every target all the time, but meaning that it was at least applied to at least one target 93% of the time. But if we look at the poll, there are times where Fiery Brand is on all targets at the same time, which is pretty cool to see. Looking a little closer at Revel in Pain, it seems that it's only going to proc from the primary target of Fiery Brand, and not when the debuff spreads, which might explain why Revel in Pain healing seems so low. While this made me slightly sad, I kept running it since we were already playing bulk extraction. Personally, if you're going to try to make this build work, you might take different pathing to get to Fiery Brand, and you might ignore bulk and Revel. We could have also probably gotten a pretty nice damage increase from Burning Blood if we decided to path through the tree differently. I tested the build a few more times in a plus 10 freehold just to see if I can replicate the damage and the uptime. And to no surprise, the damage and uptime actually seems similar on the preceding pulls. I made some quick adjustments to my weak aura to help track a few additional fragment generators, and got to pulling again without changing talents. Similar results. Now that we're feeling comfortable, I wanted to jump up to a new keystone level, that being level 15. And it turns out that I'm kind of trash. That was embarrassing, but probably exactly what you'd expect from a DH, right? Long story short, I had multiple failed attempts. Though there was this one pull where I was sustaining over 130k DPS, and it was a beautiful sight to see Fiery Brand on all 8 targets. This build allows for some pretty insane Spirit Bomb hits. I peaked at 110k critical strikes at some point. After about 7 attempts or so, I finally was able to solo this pull, but sadly I wasn't recording, and I had stopped recording to make dinner, so when I got back and started pulling again, I just forgot to hit record until I noticed it towards the end of the pull. Visual excitement. At the end of the pull, we can see that Spirit Bomb and Fiery Brand dominated the DPS meters, but more importantly, Fiery Brand had a massive 96% uptime, and you can even see that from the details timeline based on the fire damage that was being taken on multiple targets during the fight. Eventually towards the end of the pull, it dwindled, but that's because there were simply less targets alive. This build feels very Contagion-like. where the name of the game is simply to constantly spread your fiery brand by using Immolation Aura, and the goal is to keep it on or bouncing between targets as long as possible. Since I was only scaled to 410 item level, it's hard to tell if this build could actually be viable in Mythic Plus at max item level, because more haste would be helpful. I wanted to take a few minutes to break down the pros and cons of this build, and then I'll leave you guys with my final thoughts. This build is super fun, especially with this particular setup. The talent tree in conjunction with the tier set opens up this really interesting and new build that changes how you might approach playing the Vengeance Demon Hunter. Instead of depending on frailty and demon spikes, you instead shift your focus to fiery brand and that type of damage reduction. There's also a lot of potential damage with this build, especially with the right setup. In even larger pulls than this, banking both charges of Fiery Brand plus a proc of the set can quickly get Fiery Brand onto over 20 targets, which amplifies all of the fire bit damage you deal by over 40%. This feels very engaging, and honestly, I just love it. But we can't talk about the pros without mentioning the cons. This build specifically costs you a lot to play. The largest hit is in the center pathing through the tree. You lose out on Feed the Demon, but more importantly, Last Resort. This feels especially bad, but it requires over 4 points to get down to Last Resort anyways. You can try dropping some talents and like pathing to Bulk Extraction or even Revel in Pain, since it doesn't really benefit you as much from the applications of Fiery Brand spreading, but it requires even more than 4 points to get Ideal Pathing, which results in other losses. Ultimately, you have to make pretty large sacrifices, and as you saw from some of my early attempts, sometimes DHs just go splat, and not having Last Resort cooldown is tough to not play with. I can probably spend a lot of time fully dissecting the tree, but that's not the point of this video. I just want to be clear that while this is the build that the tier set kind of led me down during my testing, it's no way, shape, or form the most viable build for Mythic Plus. There's a lot more testing that needs to be done, and I'm sure a lot smarter people than me will come up with optimized builds. At the end of the day, I really like this set. I think it provides the Vengeance Demon Hunter with a generous damage reduction in single target scenarios and sufficient single target damage. The skill ceiling for the set is definitely much higher than other tank sets, simply from, tracking soul generation, the recrimination buff, and then applying it to the best target. The average Vengeance Demon Hunter enjoyer can definitely ignore the set, hit buttons, reap the benefits. But I like the idea of a tier set that opens up new build varieties, or even challenges the skill of a player by paying attention to when they have the buff and applying it to the proper target. Anyways, I want to apologize that this video was much longer than the rest. I had about 5 hours of testing footage and even more so off camera, and I just wanted to get it all into this video as, best I could. Of course, per usual, let me know what you guys think about the set in the comments below. Patreon supporters, I can't thank you guys enough for the support, because without you, this video simply wouldn't exist. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.